Cool. So that's all good. And to introduce myself, my name's Tarun. I was a Ocean Youth Ambassador 2020, so last year for Melbourne. And it's a really amazing program. If you guys have the opportunity to join Ocean Youth, would highly suggest. We did some really amazing stuff. And though we couldn't get out in the field like some of the other Ocean Youth groups, it was amazing because we had some fantastic webinars, our pitch fest, which was fantastic, and just working on a project which can really make a difference, and also meeting people who can really make a difference in both just the ocean field and just conservation and ecology in general. But we've got most of the people in, and if anyone else wants to join, we'll make sure to admit them. But I think that's enough for me. We'll pass it over to Dave and he can kick off his presentation for us.
Okay, share screen. Okay, can everyone see that screen sharing?
Looks like it.
Yep.
All right, awesome. All right, thanks for having me on board today, guys. So I'm going to have a chat to everyone about the world of seahorses. For those that haven't come across me before, my name is Dave Harasti. I'm a senior research scientist at Fisheries New South Wales, based here in sunny lockdown Port Stephens. And I'm going to give a presentation probably about the next half an hour or so about the seahorses and the research that I do, and give you a really good overview about the seahorses and what they are. So let's kick it off. So what are seahorses? Well, the genus name is Hippocampus, which in Greek means the horse sea monster. So the head of the horse and the body of the sea monster. Now they belong to the Cygnathidae family, and in that family there's about three sea dragon species, probably over 250 pipefish species now, about 7 different species of pipe horses, and the seahorses as well, of course. And they're closely related to trumpetfish and sea moss and ghost pipefish. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a trumpetfish. So that's where they're closely related. Now, as of now, there's probably around 45 recognized species of seahorses worldwide. There's new species being discovered all the time. We had a new species described last year, new pygmy seahorse called Hippocampus nalu from South Africa. So there's still new discoveries being made. And that photo on the left, that's the first time I ever saw a seahorse, which was a long time ago, back in 1997. That's a white seahorse, and that was the first time I saw one, and it's what put me on the road to research to study seahorses in the future. So what makes a seahorse? Well, obviously they've got a really long tail, a prehensile tail, like a monkey, that they use to curl around and hold on to their holdfast. They have 2 independent eyes that they can move in different directions of one another, which is really good to help them find their food. And they've got a very small dorsal fin and anal fin as well. Now, seahorses are actually quite bony animals. They're quite rigid, quite tough. If you ever hold one, you'll be surprised about how hardy and how bony they are. Now, that bony structure is really important because it protects all their organs. And they have a very, very small mouth. These guys don't have teeth. So the way that they feed, it's basically like an underwater vacuum cleaner. They're a hoover. So they go around and they're sucking up all these microscopic shrimp and crustaceans that we can't see. So if you see the bottom photo there, these are all tiny mysids and rotifers that the seahorses will feed on. And they don't have a stomach. And because they don't have a stomach, it means they're constantly having to feed for energy. So seahorse is one of the few animals that are constantly pooping all the time, because they eat and they poop. And that's because they don't have a stomach to process the food that they swallow. So where do they live? They're found all around the world, except in the coldest ocean. So you don't get them in the Arctic or the Antarctic. Seahorses themselves cannot be found in freshwater, but there are freshwater pipefish species. So there's freshwater pipefish in Australia, in South America, and in Asia. Now, all cygnathrids really like coral reefs. They like the seagrasses, sponge gardens. They like anything where they can hide, because seahorses and pipefish, they're not fast. They need to hide for camouflage so predators can't eat them. And generally, most species are found in really shallow water environments, so less than, say, 10 meters. There are some species, some of the pygmy species and the deep water seahorses, that can be found in 400 meters of water, but that is pretty rare. So how big do they get? Well, the smallest seahorse in the world, one of the pygmy seahorses, is Hippocampus denise. Now, if you hold up your little pinky nail and look at your little pinky nail, that's the size of a pygmy seahorse. All right, they grow when you stretch them out from the top of the head to the tail to about 2 centimeters total length. So they're very small, very hard to find, especially when they live on the Gorgonian Fans as they blend in, very good at camouflage. And then we have the largest seahorse species, and if you stretch that right out, it's longer than a ruler. They grow out to about 35 centimeters, and that's the potbelly seahorse, or known as Hippocampus abdominalis. And that's found in Southeast Australia, quite common in Sydney Harbour and across the Tasman into New Zealand. And that's the world's largest seahorse. Now, if you want to compare the adults versus the juveniles, the photo on the left-hand side is one of the pygmy seahorses living on a Gorgonian fan. That red pygmy seahorse is the size of your pinky nail. So the little grey baby next to it would be smaller than a grain of rice. So they are incredibly small and hard to see. And then the seahorse on the right, which is a white seahorse, that's a fully grown female. And you can see there's a newborn juvenile, probably about 2 months old, that's curled around it. Now, an interesting thing about seahorses, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's the only animal in the world where the male gives birth. So the female actually impregnates the male and she transfers her eggs into the male's pouch. Now, that male pregnancy, it can last anywhere between 2 weeks to 1 month. And after the reproductive status, the seahorse gives birth to probably anywhere between 100 and 200 babies at a time. So this male will pop out all the babies. And then what happens after he's given birth, the next day, the female will come along and she'll impregnate him again. So for some species like the white seahorse, which we have here in Australia, that poor male seahorse could be impregnated up to 8 times over a breeding season. So he's constantly just becoming pregnant, giving birth, pregnant, giving birth. The poor male is just constantly exhausted. So the life of a male seahorse isn't that easy. Now, in the pipefish and the sea dragons, they don't actually have a pouch like the seahorses do. So they carry their eggs on the underside of their tail. As you can see in that bottom photo, there's a buried male pipefish carrying all the eggs. Now, interesting, with the seahorses and the pipefish, there is no parental care. So once they give birth, those babies are on their own. There's no mum or dad to look after them in the future. To tell the difference between a male and a female in the seahorses, it's pretty obvious to see in the wild. The males will have the big pouch sticking out. So that photo on the left, it's got a big pouch, which is full of babies right now. Whereas the one on the right is a female. The females don't have a pouch. So that's the best way to identify them. Now, if you want to see what little baby seahorses are like, hopefully you can see this video playing in the background. Can you nod if you can see the video? Cool. All right, so this is filmed by one of my students a couple of years ago, and this is a male white seahorse giving birth. So he's probably got about 100 to 150 babies in his pouch. And as you can see, when the babies are being popped out, they're fully formed seahorses. They look like seahorses straight away. Now, these guys that are coming out, they're about 8 millimeters to a centimeter long. And labor for a seahorse can go anywhere from, say, 5 minutes up to an hour, because he's got to squeeze out all the babies out of his pouch. Now, see all those little baby seahorses swimming away in the water column? Unfortunately, the survival rate of baby seahorses isn't very high. They get eaten by predators, and the reason for that is, have a think about something that's delicious, small, and crunchy, like a Malteser, for example. So basically, these baby seahorses are the underwater Maltesers of the world. Everyone wants to eat them, and they're delicious. So of those 150 babies that may come out, maybe 1% to 2% will survive. And unfortunately, if they had a really high survival rate, I'd be happy, because the whole ocean would be overwhelmed with baby seahorses everywhere. But because they get eaten by the predators, the survival's not that high. Hence why they have long reproductive seasons where they breed up to 8 times a year. So to learn more about the seahorses, I spent the last 20 years studying them. And one of the reasons to study them is, one of the research things we do is we actually mark the seahorses. So we can give these seahorses unique tags to assess their movements, see their sight fidelity. We want to see what habitats they're using, looking at their reproduction, and then seeing how long they live for. And to give you an idea of how the tagging works, we use this dye, and it's called elastomer. And basically, it's a little injection that just goes underneath the skin of the seahorse. And every seahorse I come across for the research, we would give 3 little dye injections into that seahorse. So basically like little tattoos. With the 3 tags in an animal, we put them in unique parts of their body so we can individually identify every single animal. So the animal there on the left, it has 3 red tags in what we call position 5 on the seahorse. So that seahorse is R5, R5, R5. The seahorse on the right, it's got 2 orange tags in position number 2 on the seahorse and 1 tag in position number 3. So that's O2, O2, O3. So every seahorse I tag, I can uniquely identify and then follow. That allows us to look at things like monogamy. So seahorse is one of the few marine animals that we know of that displays monogamous behavior, meaning that they're faithful to one another. So here I had a couple, Grandpa and Goldilocks. Grandpa's the gray male on the right, and Goldilocks are the 2 little green tags you can see on her. She's the female. Now, these guys mated together for 3 years, and that was the first study in the wild to show that seahorses have a long-term relationship. It's not just one breeding season that they stay together, they actually stay together for subsequent breeding seasons. More recently, I followed this beautiful couple. They were called Dawn and Dusk. So Dawn's the beautiful gold seahorse named after Goldie Hawn. And we had Dusk, her partner, and they also were together for 3 years. And recently they disappeared, but they stayed in the same area for, they didn't move for about an area of about 5 meters for about 3 years. So I was able to follow them. Now, the other thing is with tagging, you're able to assess how long they live for. So by marking this seahorse on the right, which was Dawn, you can see she's got 2 orange dots in the top right of her neck and 1 on her body. I tagged her back in 2014, and she was alive until about 3 months ago, May this year, when she disappeared, and that was due to the flooding in March. So she lives for at least 7 years in the wild, and this is the oldest record of a seahorse occurring in the wild ever recorded. So we know that they now live for up to 7 years in the wild, which is slightly less than what we know for some species in aquariums. Some of these aquarium species, such as the potbelly seahorse, they've been recorded in Dallas Aquarium living for up to 11 years. Now, one of the things I was talking about just before with the underwater Maltese is that seahorses like to be eaten by a lot of different marine species. So here we have a seahorse, and you can just see that the poor seahorse has had its nose bitten off. Now, this seahorse, who I nicknamed Mr. No-Nose, he survived for 3 months after he had his nose bitten off. And the issue with the seahorse is that they're very slow. They're just slow, one of the slowest moving fishes in the ocean. So they rely on their camouflage for survival. So if there's no habitat to provide camouflage, the predators will feed on them. And those predators include blue ring octopus. So here you can see a blue ring octopus. This is a night dive years ago here in Port Stephens, where I was taking photos of this seahorse. And because I had my lights on the seahorse, this blue ring octopus became attracted to it. And the blue ring octopus came over, grabbed the seahorse by the neck and started to pull in to bite it. Now, as we know, blue ring octopus are highly venomous. They will inject a person or an animal with a tetrodotoxin, which paralyzes them. So I was sitting there with my camera taking the photos of this seahorse, and this was all happening. And I was thinking, wow, I'm going to get this amazing predation cover shot for National Geographic. But just as the octopus went to bite the seahorses, I had this conscious kick in, and I ended up smashing the octopus away with my camera. So I never got that award-winning photo. I ended up grabbing the poor traumatized seahorse and I swam it away. So that was a seahorse that lived to see another day. But the blue rings are ferocious predators of them. Here's another very keen predator of the seahorse, especially locally in Port Stephens. This is the striped anglerfish. Now, the striped anglerfish is a master of camouflage, so much so that the 2 seahorses in this photo don't actually realize that it's an anglerfish. So you can see the seahorse up the top with its body, with its tail curled around the tail of the anglerfish. And just in the very front of the anglerfish, you can see the outline of another seahorse, a juvenile seahorse. And the anglerfish, they've got one of the fastest feeding motions in the marine world, and they'll swallow a seahorse whole. The other predators that we have like the scorpionid fishes. So up top left is the red rock cod. The bottom photo on the left is the cuttlefish. Cuttlefish love baby seahorses particularly. And then we've got our dusky flathead, and the flathead another predator. And this one's my nemesis. So for those of you that like the Netflix documentary, Octopus's Teacher, and you fall in love with octopuses, this is my little public spiel to tell you that octopus aren't cool. They're little seahorse, little munching buggers, and we don't like them. And this is why. This is one of my all-time favorite seahorses called George. And I've been following George, who lived on a Gorgonian Fan for about 3 years. And one day I came across this, and this was George. And what had happened is an octopus in a nearby bottle that was living in decided that George was going to be dinner. So when I came across it, I tried to rescue George. And unfortunately, the octopus, as you can see, has taken George's body, eating George, and left me just with George's head. So for those of you that loved Octopus's Teacher, now you know why we don't like octopus, and octopus should be eradicated. Moving on. Now, seahorses are in decline worldwide, not just because of the octopus, but for many different reasons. Of the 45 species of seahorses known around the world, many of them are on the IUCN Red List. We have some that are listed as near threatened. We have some that are listed as vulnerable species, but most sadly and concerning is we have 2 species listed as endangered. And that's the South African seahorse, Hippocampus compensis, which is only found in 3 estuaries in South Africa. And closer to home, the white seahorse, which is listed as an endangered species. Now, the causes of their decline are 3 things. The first one is overfishing. So seahorses are sold on the market, and they're collected in countries such as like India, Vietnam, Thailand, and where they'll be sold on the black market, and they're sent to places like Hong Kong, where they're used in traditional Chinese medicine. The second cause for their decline is incidental bycatch. So trawl fishing. So the trawl nets, as they go over the seagrass and the seafloor, they often pick up seahorses as bycatch. The other problem with the trawling is that trawling actually destroys the habitats of the seahorses that live on. And that's number 3, which is a big concern in places for, in New South Wales, where I am, where we're losing a lot of the habitat where the white seahorse lives on. So as I mentioned, they're used in traditional Chinese medicine. That they're used to cure a range of alleged illnesses, well, not alleged, a range of illnesses. And apparently they work by helping fix respiratory issues, male impotence. They're meant to be good for your liver. And what happens is people grind up the seahorses and they'll drink them in a tea. Now, I don't know the benefits of drinking seahorses. I'm a bit skeptical to see if that would actually do anything. The other thing is, the ones that are caught as bycatch, they're sold as curios. So if you're ever in the markets and you see a dried seahorse on a chain or in a paperweight, one of those resin paperweights, don't buy it, because once you buy things like that, you're creating a demand for it. So it's best not to buy them. The other one is, and it's not so much a concern anymore because the aquariums are actually on board with captive breeding programs, but there is some unregulated trade for the aquarium industry. And it was estimated in a 2017 study that over 37 million seahorses were taken as bycatch in a year. Fortunately, in Australia, we have good protection for the species. So they were listed in New South Wales in 2004. They all became protected species. In 2020, the white seahorse, which is one that I study and it's found around here, it became listed as an endangered species. And once it's listed as an endangered species and it's protected, it means that there's no longer any take of that allowed from the wild. But it also means we have to protect and conserve the habitats that it lives on. So the white seahorse, which has been the focus of my research and was my PhD, it's endemic to the east coast of Australia. It basically occurs from Hervey Bay down to around Jervis Bay in New South Wales. It's an estuarine species. It's only found in estuaries and coastal embayments down to depths of around 13, 14 meters. Now, this species has a very small home range. So Dawn, that I mentioned before, the world's oldest seahorse, in that 7 years that I followed her, she moved a grand distance of 30 meters. So they don't move much. They basically, the white seahorse, they find a habitat that they like, be it a sponge or a Gorgonian fan, and I refer to it as their happy place. Once they find their happy place and they find a mate, they'll stay there forever. They grow to a maximum size of 16 centimeters. And as I mentioned before, they're monogamous and they live for over 7 years in the wild. Now, unfortunately, the white seahorse is disappearing, and that's a result of habitat loss. So as I said before, one of the greatest threats to seahorses worldwide is the loss of habitats. So seagrasses, mangrove forests, coral reefs, they're all threatened by human activities. Activities such as land reclamation, coastal development, such as building of marinas or building breakwalls, the trawling of the seafloor where the nets will wipe out a heap of seahorse habitats. These are all causing seahorses worldwide to decline. And more recently, we've got the concerning impacts of climate change on the environment. So as the oceans heat up, you're losing species such as coral reefs, the kelp forests of New South Wales and Southern Australia are at risk. And if you lose the habitats, then the seahorses won't have those places to live. So to give you an example of the importance of habitat, I did a study back in 2014, and if you want to see, it's in the Journal of Fish Biology, where I assessed what were the most important habitats for the white seahorse. And we found it, photo on the left, they love to live in the Posidonia australis seagrass, and that Posidonia seagrass is an endangered species in New South Wales. The photo of the right is a male living on a red sponge. They love sponge gardens. And this one here is the soft coral. It's known as the cauliflower soft coral, Dendronephtha australis. Now, this soft coral is now listed as an endangered species under the Commonwealth Act and also in New South Wales. It has dramatically declined over the past decade, and I'll show you some examples of that in a sec. Here's a nice example of perfect seahorse habitat. You've got some sponges on the left and you've got some soft corals on the right. And if you have a look closely in this photo, you can actually see a seahorse well camouflaged. So I'll give you a sec to see if you can find it. As I said before, they're a very slow moving species, so they rely on that camouflage for survival. So there it is there. And if you've got really keen eyesight, you can just see on that seahorse a couple of green dots, and they're the tags, so I can identify that animal. One of the habitats in Port Stephens where the white seahorse was commonly found was on this Gorgonian fan, Euplexaura. Now in this photo, there's another, you can see a seahorse in this photo as well. The seahorses have this amazing ability to change their color, their entire body color, to match the habitat they're living on. So if you've got a gold Gorgonian fan, you're going to have a gold seahorse living on it. In the seagrass, for example, the seahorses are quite grey to black colours to blend in with the dark seagrasses. In those cauliflower soft corals, they're generally white to pink in colour. So they'll change their colour over a matter of days to match what they're living on. So I was talking about why the white seahorse is in decline, and it's all attributed to habitat loss. So this is what happens when habitat is destroyed. So where I live in Port Stephens, which is in the Port Stephens Great Lakes Marine Park, I had 4 main study sites, which are all popular scuba diving destinations. And I have really good long-term data sets for 2 of those sites, the Pipeline Dive Site and the Seahorse Gardens Dive Site. Seahorse Gardens Dive Site was so named because of numbers of seahorses that are found there. And if you ever want to learn more about this, you can follow up this paper online. In the Port Stephens estuary, the habitats are susceptible to 3 main impacts. The first one is damage from boat anchors. So you can see in the top left, a boat anchor that's dragging across some seagrass. The second one is mooring. So a mooring that's put down can damage the habitat. And the third one is sand inundation. And that has recently become a big issue in Port Stephens because we've had a lot of East Coast lows lately, which cause sand to move and smother habitats. Here's an example of the impact of boat anchoring. This is the Seahorse Gardens dive site. And on any given nice sunny day, you can have up to 10 or so boats anchoring directly on top of these sensitive marine habitats. The second one is the moorings. So moorings are put down on a block and chain. And what happens is that chain will drag across the sea floor and basically scours out and wipes out all the habitats in the vicinity of that mooring. And they can have a very large impact. Here's an example. If you have a look at Google Earth and just zoom in at any mooring area in Lake Macquarie or Sydney Harbour or in Port Stephens, all those light green patches are where the mooring chain has spun around and scoured out all the seagrass. There shouldn't be any light patches there. It should be all nice dark green seagrasses. So the moorings can destroy up to 700 square meters just by spinning with the boats on them. So we need solutions such as environmentally friendly moorings installed, which don't impact on the sensitive marine habitats such as seagrass. The soft corals that I was talking about, the cauliflower soft coral, they're extremely susceptible to disturbance, particularly anchors because they're shallow rooted. So an anchor would go through and just pull them out. And this is the two sites that I was looking at long-term, the pipeline and the Seahorse Gardens. The lined area is the extent of the soft coral habitat in 2011. And when I went back in 2015, you can see that the soft coral habitats have greatly declined. So there really wasn't much left of that soft coral, and that was caused by moorings and boats anchoring and some sand inundation. So an example of the sand movement coming through, this is the before and after shot. This is the pipeline dive site in 2011. So you can see beautiful soft corals, which is basically a football field of soft corals. A sand event happened with a big storm, and a month later, all the soft corals were buried and disappeared. The soft corals don't have the ability to get up and swim and move away. And once the sand comes over top of them, they basically are smothered and then they die. And what happens to the seahorses that have been living in those soft corals, they then need to leave that habitat and find a suitable habitat elsewhere. But when they make that trek to find a new habitat, they become very susceptible to predators as they're moving across sandy areas. And here's an example of the decline of the white seahorse population. You can see from 2006 to 2009, it fluctuated a bit, but the numbers are pretty good. But then you can see when I went back in 2014, 2015, following the habitat loss, the numbers of the white seahorses dramatically declined. And to put those figures into context, from 2019 to 2015, the seahorses declined by 97%, as the soft corals declined by 95%. So the Seahorse Gardens dive site was now just not even, there's no seahorses, so it's just called sand gardens. And similarly, the pipeline site, where the seahorses declined by 83%, and that was linked to the decline of both the soft corals and the sponge habitats. So the take-home message is, if you lose the habitats, you lose the seahorses. So what can we do to help recover declining seahorse populations? So there's a new concept that I've come up with called Seahorse Hotels. This idea came about in about 2015 when I was trying to figure out how can we put habitats back into the environment for the seahorses to colonize and help them increase in abundance. And the whole Seahorse Hotels concept came from me coming across old lost fish traps, commercial fish traps on the seafloor that had turned into new living marine ecosystems. And here's some examples. So this is an old lost fish trap. And after about 5 years, it's covered in all these beautiful sponges. And these beautiful sponges become home for fish and invertebrates. And they become their basically new marine ecosystem. And here's another trap. This is about one that had been lost for about 7 years. So you can see beautiful sponge habitats on it. And what I was seeing is that the seahorses were starting to move onto these old lost fish traps. And I thought maybe we could come up with an idea of purposefully designing a structure, an artificial seahorse habitat, to help seahorses recolonize areas where the habitats have been lost. So in 2018, 2019, we trialed a new project looking at the efficiency of seahorse hotels. And I did this in collaboration with Dr. Michael Simpson, who was my PhD student from University of Sydney. And we installed a whole heap of seahorse hotels in Port Stephens to see if seahorses would come and colonize them. So this is what they look like. So this is the first prototype design that we came up with the seahorse hotels. They're made out of an aluminium frame and a 1 meter by 1 meter frame, about 50 centimeters high. And we had, because they're made out of aluminium, they're very light, so we had to put some house bricks in the corners to weight them down. Now, outside of the house bricks, everything in these Seahorse hotels is completely biodegradable. So they break down over time in the ocean environment. So electrolysis happens, the metal breaks down. So the idea is the seahorses will move onto here, the natural habitats will start growing on them. And then when the steel breaks down and rusts away, what you're left behind with is the natural habitats. So how did it go? Within the first 3 months, we had seahorses move onto them. In total, over the 12-month project, we had 63 different individuals living on the 18 Seahorse hotels at the pipeline site. In the breeding season, when the breeding season came about, we had pregnant seahorses mating. So we watched them reproduce on the hotels. We watched them get pregnant. And then we had several of them breeding subsequently several times over the breeding season. And then the juveniles would turn up on the hotels as well. So they turned out to be a great success, which was really useful. And we published a paper on this if you want to look at marine environmental research. Now, if you have a look on the photo on the left, you can see that's one of the juvenile seahorses that's just moved on. He's got a couple of little red dots on him so I can identify him. And the photo in the bottom left is one of the old Seahorse hotels 6 months after deployment. So you can see the marine growth occurring on it. So this is what one of the hotels looked like 18 months later. The hotel's completely collapsed. And what's left behind is the beautiful algae, the sponges, the bryozoans growing on it. And in this photo, you can actually see 2 seahorses are living on it. Now, these 2 seahorses that are on this collapsed hotel, they were 2 that are actually moved into it in the original 3 months. So 18 months later, they're still living on this collapsed habitat. And if you haven't found the 2 seahorses, I'll give you 5 seconds to find them. There you go. So like I said, masters of camouflage. And this is one of the Seahorse hotels 3 years later, completely covered in sponges, beautiful ecosystem. It's got fish on it, it's got seahorses on it. And in the words and the great American philosopher Kevin Costner in the fantastic movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. So the whole concept is if you can put habitats in there for seahorses to utilize, they will come to them and they will use them. Now, you can actually help support the White Seahorse Recovery Program by visiting this website, cbnb.com.au. And this is a new partnership with Taylor's Wines and the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. So we've launched the CBNB initiative to help raise money to purchase seahorse hotels, to put them back into areas for the endangered white seahorse to recover. And just recently, in June this year, we had our new seahorse hotel designs. Through the CBNB initiative with Taylor's Wines, we put 20 new seahorse hotels into Sydney Harbour. They went into Little Manly Cove and Delwood Beach. And these ones are made out of galvanised steel. So they're going to last longer than the aluminium frames, because we did find it out the really thin aluminium broke down a bit too quick. So hopefully these will last 3 to 5 years for the seahorses. And now we're monitoring how effective they are, this new design, with University of Technology Sydney, and I've got a new master's student, Mitch Brennan, who's going to work on this project. So this is just started. It's all a pretty exciting campaign for us at the moment. And the idea is the CBNB initiative will roll out from Sydney Harbour into other sites across New South Wales where the white seahorse needs help to recover. And finally, to help recover this species in the wild, we've implemented a conservation stocking program. And this is really exciting. This is a world first program to help recover seahorses in the wild. It's a collaboration with Sea Life Aquarium, so Sydney Aquarium, UTS, and New South Wales DPI. And we commenced this project in 2000, let's just call it pre-COVID. And we collected adult seahorses from the wild and took them into Sea Life Aquarium. And we placed them in their brand new, fantastic exhibit. And this is the exhibit that you can see at Sydney Aquarium when the aquarium opens up to the public again. And we put this beautiful display showcasing how they're an endangered species. And as part of it, we're raising they're breeding in there, and we're raising the babies in captivity for a release back into the wild. And here you can see, here's the first batch of newborn babies. So as I said, white seahorse are about 1 centimetre long, and we house them in the aquarium for about 7 months or so, till they're at a sufficient size to be released back in the wild. Basically, what we're doing by raising them in captivity, we're increasing their rates of survival because like I said, when they're born in the wild, they're small, tasty little Maltesers and only about 1% survive. So if we release them when they're a lot bigger and a lot hardier, that is going to increase their survival. So prior to the release, we tag all the baby seahorses with the elastomer. So you can see photo on the left, you've got 2 pink dots and a green dot, and the one on the right, there's a couple of green dots. And the reason for that is because we wanted to follow these babies in the wild to see if they survived or not. So 90 baby seahorses released in the Clifton Gardens in Sydney Harbour in April last year. Photo on the left, there's a couple of green dots in that one. The one on the right's got a couple of red dots. And we released them onto Seahorse Hotels at Clifton Gardens. And these Seahorse Hotels we put in 2 months earlier, so they had a fair bit of growth occurring on them. We have found that seahorses don't like clean hotels. It takes them a couple of months to come and use the hotels once there's marine growth on there. And the reason for that is that the marine growth helps them camouflage, and the marine growth also brings with it food for them. So all the little biota, like the copepods and amphipods that come in marine growth, are there for the seahorses to feed on. So we released 45 baby seahorses onto the hotels, and we released another 45 babies onto the protective swimming nets. So this is Mitch Brennan. He's the new master student, releasing them and putting them onto the hotels. And then we monitored them. Originally, we were monitoring them every couple of days, and then it was weekly, and then fortnightly, and then over 12 months, we turned it into once a month. So here you can see, this is one of the hotels, and you can see a week later, we had 3 of them living on this hotel, all happy. And over the 12 months, we've just wrapped up the monitoring program now looking at data. We've still got seahorses that were released in April last year, still living on the hotels now. The numbers have dropped off as they've moved away, or they've looked for mates, or they've been predated upon. We've had a bit of an infestation of cuttlefish and octopus near the hotels, so we need to figure out how to remove them. So the ongoing monitoring now is assessing their survival, their growth, and their breeding. And hopefully, in the future, these seahorse hotels will become a really good refuge for the baby seahorses to be released on. And we plan on releasing more baby seahorses later this year onto those new seahorse hotels at Little Manly and Delwood Beach. So it's a very exciting new initiative that you'll probably hear more about in the future, I'd say. And with that, I'll wrap it up, and more than happy to take any questions from anyone. Hopefully you found that interesting.
That was amazing. Thank you very, very much for that. And I had quite a fair few questions, but like almost 90% of them were answered in that presentation, which was awesome. But we do have some questions here from our Ocean Youth participants. And if we just go back from the start, so the first question we've got is from Elijah, who is wanting to ask, how do seahorses actually change colors?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's still unknown, but it's got something to do with the filaments in their skin. So similar to a chameleon and a cuttlefish, they have the ability to change the filaments in their skin, the tones in their skin, to blend in to the color that they're living on. And when a seahorse is mating, they actually will go from a really dark color to a light color. They have the ability to change their skin tone very, very quickly. But for them to change their color to a permanent, from a black to a gold, actually takes a couple of days to blend into their habitat. So it's all about the changing of color in their skins.
Right, and so that means that dawn and dusk are basically the same species, but they're just 2 separate colors for their environment.
Yeah, so the white seahorse, which is one I work on, it actually doesn't come in white. It's very rare to find a white one. The reason why it's named a white seahorse is actually named after the Surgeon General from the First Fleet, John White. So in honor of him, he discovered the seahorse and he sent it off to a taxonomist, Bleecker, and they named it the white Hippocampus whitei after him. But it's the one color that I rarely see. You don't often get them white. You get them black, gold, red, purple, green. Very seldom is it white. And probably that's because white stands out a lot and wouldn't be very good for them to camouflage.
Wow. And we've got another question to follow up from that, which Kate asked. And she just wanted to know, are there any anchoring or mooring rules in the areas being changed with like the seahorse hotels, so we don't lose the new habitats or they don't get crushed by like anchors or that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's really important. So we know that anchoring is a problem. We know that moorings are a problem. So in areas where there might be a marine park, for example, we can put in regulations or zones, we might have a no anchoring zone to protect the sensitive marine habitats. And that has been done in the past, and hopefully will be done in the future as well to help protect the white seahorse and other sensitive marine habitats such as the endangered cauliflower coral. With the moorings though, the moorings are an easy fix. There's new technologies out there. Instead of using the block and chain mooring, which spins around and scours out the seafloor, you can have an environmentally friendly mooring, which is a pole into the seafloor with a bungee rope. So it actually doesn't drag on the seafloor and it doesn't harm the habitat. So that's a really good alternative. And hopefully in the future, we'll see areas where the seagrass has been impacted on, we'll see moorings change to those environmentally friendly moorings. Because like I said, if you bring the habitats back, you can bring the seahorses back.
Right. And Margot here has two questions. The first one is, have the CB&Bs in Sydney been placed in no mooring areas? And we'll get a response to that one first.
Yep, so then they're in areas where there are no moorings. So we deliberately put them in areas where the moorings can't occur. And now under New South Wales legislation, it's really good. You can't actually put moorings in areas where there's sensitive marine habitats such as Posidonia seagrass or the cauliflower coral. So the moorings, existing moorings, they stay there and hopefully they'll be upgraded one day to environmentally friendly moorings. But where we've put the hotels now, no moorings will go. Unfortunately, they are still susceptible to anchoring, but we did put them in areas where they're not known fishing spots.
Awesome. And she, to follow up with that, has asked, has your research investigated if seahorses have a choice on what their preferred habitat is, being like seagrass or sponges or the Gorgonian fans?
That's a really good question. Okay, so I did a study here in Port Stephens which showed in the wild, adult seahorses prefer to live in sponge habitats and those cauliflower soft corals. And their second choice behind those two was the Posidonia seagrass. They actually actively avoided some habitats. So they don't live in sand. They didn't live in the Zostera seagrass. They didn't really choose to live in the algae. So the wild studies showed that. But we've done studies in aquarium where we've done selection studies where we put different habitats in an aquarium and we put seahorses through various trials to see what habitats they would use. And what we found is that in the experiment we did is that they actually chose the protective swimming net material over seagrass, over the macroalgae and over the kelp. So I actually like the artificial habitat more than the actual natural habitat. And we're actually replicating that study now with really small baby seahorses at Sydney Aquarium. And we're actually finding the babies right now are actually choosing the net and the Posidonia seagrass. So it's a bit ongoing. The key for the seahorses, as long as they have somewhere to curl their tail around and anchor down, they'll use it as habitat. And it has to be something that's quite hardy for them to hold on because they're often found in areas where there's strong current. And if they can't hold on to their tail, they'll get swept away.
Right, and a net probably makes sense since it's got all of these small holes and lots of material that they can wrap their tails around. And to follow along with that, Amira has got a question just in regards to actually how we can promote the conservation. And she asks, what do you think will be some effective ways that we can do to promote and educate others on the safety of seahorses?
I often say when I talk to people about seahorses, they're a bit like our canary in the ocean. So like the canary that you're taking to mines. They're a really important indicator species. If you have a healthy marine environment with great habitats and lots of marine habitats, you'll have seahorses. If you have an area where there's no seahorses occurring, it's telling you there's a problem. And that problem might be that you've got either poor water quality or you've got no habitats for the seahorses to live in. So they're an iconic species that we should be using as an indicator and a flagship for ocean conservation, because if you can save the seahorses, you can save the seas.
Right, and finally with that, Charm just asks, so she's just noticed something is that, so where the beach that she lives at, there are lots of shark nets and the nets are being hauled every winter. And she had a suggestion that installing a Seahorse Hotel there would be a good idea. But is there sort of a further, I guess, range that you're looking to take the hotels out even further?
Okay, so on the shark nets, in New South Wales, we have a shark net program. I'm not sure where she lives, but I'm just going to imagine it's one of the ocean beaches. So like Manly and Bondi, and they have these shark nets put out off the beaches to minimize interactions with sharks. Now, seahorses don't use those nets. The seahorses that we're dealing with, the white seahorses and the populated in New South Wales, they live in the protected estuaries and embayments. they don't live on those nets offshore because it's too rough for them. They can't live in areas where there's waves. So every time they're taking those nets out offshore, it doesn't affect the seahorse populations. The protective swimming nets that you get in Sydney Harbour and Lake Macquarie, they're permanent, and they just become fantastic habitat for the seahorse because they get covered in algae and sponges and corals, and the seahorses live on there permanently. So the shark nets offshore, definitely not used by seahorses. It's protective swimming nets in the estuaries, which the seahorses love.
Right, and Margot just has a question, not seahorse related particularly, but to follow along with those shark nets is because of the issues that they have for marine environments, is there any sort of news or work being done on modified nets to save or have the feature of saving or keeping people protected, but also keeping the sharks away as well?
Yep, so there's been some excellent trials in New South Wales, which has been led by New South Wales DPI, where they're using these things called smart drum lines. And the smart drum lines are an alternative to the nets that they're trialing. And they've used them up on the North Coast, and they've trialed them in other regions, which show that they can still protect the beaches, but they're minimizing the incidental capture of species such as turtles and other species that they don't want to catch. So yeah, trials are underway, and the smart drum lines have been very effective.
Cool. And a question that I sort of wanted to ask is, you sort of mentioned this earlier, but seahorses are, I guess, such a niche or sort of particular field. And what sort of drove you to really go this deep into seahorses?
When I went to university, oh gosh, what was that? 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago, I actually went to university to become a park ranger. I wanted to save all the koalas and kangaroos. I wanted to hug all the terrestrial wildlife. And it wasn't until 2/3 of the way through my degree that I actually took up snorkeling, and I loved the marine environment. And then I actually got into scuba diving. So I changed my whole degree to go from wanting to save the cute and cuddlies to wanting to become a marine scientist. And I went in the marine science field, and it wasn't until I showed you that photo, I saw my first seahorse in 1997. I got completely captivated by it. Found out that there was no research being done on seahorses in Australia. We didn't know anything about them. So I thought, well, someone's got to do something to learn more about them. Why are they disappearing, and what can we do to help them? And that's what led me down the road to become a seahorse scientist. So I went from wanting to save koalas now to saving a small seahorse species about 15 centimeters long. But it's good because I get to spend a lot of time in the ocean and studying them. So it's been very rewarding.
And the next question was going to be, what is your favorite part of the job? But I'm guessing that is spending time in the ocean with the seahorses.
The job of a marine scientist is very diverse. So one day I might be I've worked on marine turtles, the next day I might be working on seahorses, might be on sharks, but it's not always roses. So I'd say 90% of my time lately is spent in my office, processing data or analyzing videos. It's that 10% of the time when you're out in the field and you're swimming around the blue water and a humpback whale swims past you underwater, or you have a turtle, or you see a seahorse. They're the moments that make it all really, really worthwhile. But then on the flip side, there's times where we have to go diving, and it might be in Sydney Harbour in winter where it's 15 degrees. The visibility is only about 1 metre, so you can't see your hand, and you've got to go down and you've got to look for a certain fish or something. So it's not always blue water, tropical, and swimming around in board shorts. Sometimes it's really cold, dark, and murky. And they're the days you're like, oh, why am I a marine scientist again?
Yeah, and I guess those challenges, both in field, but are there any other challenges that you sort of face with the work that you're doing, whether it be like the data or understanding something or anything of that sort?
It's not a challenge, but it's very hard to work on a species that you're seeing disappear in the wild. So I talked about that cauliflower soft coral, which the seahorse lives on. That's an endangered species now. And we've recently just mapped its distribution in Port Stephens, where there used to be tens of thousands of it. Since the March floods that we had, there's only 30 of those colonies less. We're down to less than 1% of the existing population size. So for me to go diving and see what used to be this beautiful environment thriving with cauliflower corals and seals living on, it's actually quite saddening. So I can do dives in areas that I was really passionate about, and now I'll go into these areas and I don't recognize them, and it saddens me that other people won't see what it used to be like. And then watching the white seahorse decline down to about 10% of its original population size from 20 years ago, I used to go and sit on a dive and I could count 40 seahorses now, no problems, find them easily. Now I go for a dive here, and if I find 5, I consider that to be a really successful dive. So seeing species disappear in front of me, it's actually really hard to deal with. And it's just, and you know, I imagine it's not just a marine scientist, it's other scientists around the world that work on, you know, forests when a bushfire goes through and they lose all the koalas and things like that. So it can be really tough to be a scientist sometimes, especially when you're working on particular species that are, you know, that are threatened and disappearing in front of you. You feel like you can do whatever, you try and do whatever you can to help save them, but sometimes it's a losing battle.
Sure, yeah. And I guess for the budding scientists here, Amira asks, what are some tips that you sort of have for someone who's looking to get into a field of work like this?
So one of the things, you learn a lot at university, but I have actually learned most of my knowledge has come from diving and being in the environment, being underwater, seeing what marine species do, how they interact. I used to have a thing where every time I'd go for a dive, I had to learn the scientific name of 2 species. So I'd come out of the water and I'd have a photographic memory, or I'd even sometimes take a slate and draw what I saw, and I'd have to identify in a book. So over time, you know, I do 100 dives, I could identify 200 species. So that's just one way. If you want to become a marine scientist or terrestrial science, start learning the names of the animals out there. Start learning what you're seeing in a marine environment. Don't just think, oh, that's a really cute yellow and black fish. Go and learn what the name of that fish is. That's a stripy fish, for example. Or if you find a seahorse, figure out what the name of that seahorse is. And there's a really good resource for that called iNaturalist, where you can post your photos to that you take of marine life or terrestrial life, and you have scientists who will identify them. And the other tip I'll give is, if you have time, try and volunteer with organizations that are doing work that you're interested in. So if you want to work in as an aquarist, see if you can do some volunteer work at the aquarium. We have a shark and race center up here where people love turtles, so they work on the rehabilitation of turtles. So working on those animals as a volunteer basis will give you that knowledge about them and help you in the future. So yeah, volunteering is really good, and learning about what you're wanting to work on.
Awesome. And going back to the topic of seahorses, I sort of had this question about, I guess, relationships that seahorses might have with their environment. And have you ever noticed any sort of like symbiotic behavior between seahorses and, I guess, a particular species in their environment, or something where, you know, 2 species are benefiting from?
I don't think I've ever, no. The only thing, if you call octopus eating seahorses symbiosis, it really is a one-way relationship. There's not any other species that really benefit from, there's no symbiosis with seahorses. You can maybe say, you know, that when they're living on the soft corals, they're eating all the crustaceans that might be eating the polyps or the soft coral or something, but it's not something that's ever been noted or worked out. But yeah, not those nasty octopus though.
Okay, well, so we've established a hate for octopus. But
it's not a hate. It's just like, if they'd leave my seahorses alone, we could have a really nice relationship.
I'll keep that in mind and make sure I can pass it on the next time I meet an octopus. But Laura has a really good question here about, she just wanted to ask, do you think the tropicalization of the Sydney Harbour area might see the introduction of tropical species of like seahorse, for example?
Oh, great question. And funnily enough, I've published 2 papers on range extensions of seahorses into New South Wales. So there's a thorny seahorse, which is generally found in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. And we've had occurrences of that 10 years ago coming down on the East Australian Current and turning up in places like Port Stephens. So we've had about 4 individuals now turn up here that I've seen. And more recently, there's a seahorse known as the Great Seahorse. It's one of the larger ones. Another one that's found in the tropics. It's recently been found at Botany Bay. So as waters may warm or the currents strengthen with warm water, we are going to see tropical species range extensions into areas such as Sydney. And that's why, you know, you can go into Cabbage Tree Bay off Manly and you can see great corals there now and lots of little tropical damselfish living in those corals. Who knows, it might not be too long before we have anemones and Nemo on our doorsteps down here.
Geez, that's really cool. But do you, well, now that you mentioned that of like seahorses coming from like Indonesia population or like down to Australia, is there a potential risk of these like non-native seahorses giving a risk to our native range of seahorses or becoming like a potentially invasive species at all?
Not so much an invasive species, because seahorses are very chilled out dudes, which, you know, just like to live in a happy place and won't harm anyone. But you raise a point where you are seeing species shift southwards and that they can become problematic. And for example, looking at Tasmania and the urchins that have moved across Bass Strait into the waters of Tasmania and have been feeding on the giant kelp forest down there, and the giant kelp's disappearing. So there's always potential risk of a range extension in the species. Fortunately for seahorses, like I said, they're just chilled out, happy people, and all fish love them except for octopus. So they're not going to harm anyone.
Awesome. And with that, do seahorses, other than like physical or like, you know, large predator fish, for example, is there ever a risk of them being exposed to like certain diseases or that kind of thing which could affect them aside from like a big fish eating them?
Disease can occur in seahorses. In the wild, it's very rare. I think out of the thousands of seahorses I've worked with, maybe once or twice I've seen an infection on a seahorse. And that infection is generally caused when they've been bitten by an animal, they've been attacked, and then the wound doesn't heal. In aquarium, though, it's different. In aquarium, they're much more susceptible to bacterial diseases, etc., in the water. But they're pretty easily treated through, the vets will have different sort of antibiotics for the water, which will clear them up. But in the wild, disease in seahorses are very rare.
Sure. And Margot also just has another question here, just I guess an overall awareness of ocean life. And she just wanted to ask, how can we all help to increase awareness of the importance of marine life and the impacts that the system is facing?
Well, one of the ways I think is important for people to showcase the marine environment, I love to take photos. I love to take videos of marine life. So my whole presentation I've just shown is all my photos. And if you have a Facebook account, if you have an Instagram account, a Twitter, etc., the more people that post the beauty of the marine life and they talk about the marine life and its importance, and then they talk about the threatened species and then how they're declining, it raises the awareness of it. There are so many people in the Port Stephens area where I live that had no idea about the decimation that the March floods had caused the marine environment. It wasn't until we put some articles in the papers about it that people actually went, wow, is it really that dramatic? Has it changed that much? So you need to use your social media and your media outlets, take good photos, take good videos and share them. Help promote what's in the marine environment so people can see the beauty of it, understand it, and then see what the threats are to it as well.
Awesome. And does anyone else have any questions, because feel free to just post them in the chat again. But one question I had just regarding the white seahorses, you mentioned that in the Sydney Aquarium, they had some juveniles that they were growing up to then be released. Now, if these seahorses were to breed in captivity and then those young were to release, would they face any sort of problems because they were born and I guess raised to an extent in a captive environment?
So that's a good point. So one of the reasons we've done a project in such a way, so we've taken animals living in Sydney Harbour, the adults, and put them into the aquarium because we didn't want to bring seahorses from another area, which may change the genetic diversity when we release them back into the wild. So the second thing is when they're raised in the Sydney Aquarium, that water is actually a flow-through system. They're pumping the water straight from Darling Harbour into Sea Life Aquarium and back out. So the water that the seahorses are in is actually exactly the same as the water that they're going to go back into. And then prior to their release, as we're tagging all those 90 seahorses that were released, for example, everyone's inspected to see if there's any disease, any bacteria, any infections on them prior to release. And then we make sure we have the veterinary approval before we put them back in the ocean. But the most important thing is we don't get seahorses, say, from Jervis Bay, bring them into the aquarium and then release them, say, in Port Stephens. We want to make sure that wherever we put the seahorses, that's where the source population came from.
Okay, great. So yeah, that way it's like saving the genetic diversity, but also the environmental standpoint as well. And A burning question I had is, why does the female deposit the eggs to the male? Like, why can't she just give birth?
Well, that's a question that no one's been able to answer. So it is
Right.
a very good question. Everyone's like, why is it a male seahorse? Why isn't it a female seahorse? It's got the pouch, so you think it's a female. So actually what makes it the male is that inside that male is the sperm, right? So the male carries the sperm inside his pouch, and then the female is the one that puts the eggs inside the pouch for the male's sperm to fertilize, and which raises the babies, and then the male gives birth. Why is it reversed in the animal kingdom? And that is a great mystery and a great unknown. Feel free to do a PhD on
I shall. But yeah, so that's basically all the other questions, and it doesn't look like we have anything further coming in. So just a massive, massive thank you for joining us today and giving us that presentation, because there was just tons of information which I didn't know on there, and I'm guessing a lot of other people here that didn't know on there as well. And hopefully we'll get some new seahorse scientists popping up. But yeah, just a huge thank you for that.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to share my love of seahorses to everyone. And if you're ever interested, just follow me on Twitter at my Twitter, Dave Harasti, because I'm always posting photos of seahorses and marine life and sharing lots of videos about the beauty that we have here in New South Wales.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Well, that's it from us, and a massive thank you for everyone joining us in the audience. If you're looking to watch this again, or there are some facts that you wanted to catch up on, this will be on YouTube along with all of the other Sea Life socials. So definitely go ahead and check it out there as well. But thanks for that.